The discussion of Satan has never been merely a myth told to children, nor just a mysterious being in the margins of religious texts. Rather, it is one of the most present concepts in human consciousness. Between the pages of the Torah and the books of the New Testament, and between the writings of the rabbis and the volumes of Christian theology, a complex image was formed. At times, Satan appears as a heavenly adversary, performing a judicial role by God's permission, and at other times as an angel who fell through his pride to lead the armies of darkness, then later turning into a moral symbol of desire and deviant passions. From Job, whose faith was tested with permission from heaven, to the temptations faced by Christ in the wilderness, and from Belial in the Dead Sea Scrolls to Lucifer in the Latin translations, texts, myths, and interpretations intertwined to shape a multidimensional image. Yet the question remains, is Satan an independent reality, or a symbol created by societies to explain evil and inner conflict? In this video, we will embark on a journey through texts and traditions, from the Hebrew Satan to the Greek diabolos, and from Jewish literature to Christian theology, to analyze the major transformations that turned Satan at times into a heavenly adversary with limited authority, and at other times into a cosmic leader of darkness. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel to follow all that is new. When we return to the linguistic roots, we find that the term Satan or Satan, Hashatan in the Hebrew text, was not originally the name of an independent cosmic enemy or a dark deity. Rather, it was merely a functional description, meaning the adversary, the accuser, or even the prosecutor in a judicial context. In other words, Satan did not appear in early Judaism as an absolute metaphysical force, but rather as a judicial role in a heavenly court, representing the function of prosecution before God, observing human beings and testing their sincerity. When the term later moved into the Greek language, the language of the New Testament, it took another form, diabolos, meaning the slanderer, or the one who causes division among people. This linguistic shift was not merely a literal translation, but a development in meaning. Diabolos came to refer to a figure that goes beyond a mere adversary to become a symbol of temptation and division among human beings. Thus, the original concept of the Hebrew Satan and the Greek diabolos was not an independent entity, but rather a temporary function under the authority of God, far removed from the dualistic concept of absolute good and evil, performing the role of an adversary within the heavenly scene, subject to divine sovereignty. When the Hebrew Bible is read carefully, it becomes clear that Satan appears as part of the divine scene, but he is neither equal to God nor a force standing in opposition to him. Rather, he always operates under God's authority and permission. In the book of Job, chapters 1 to 2, the Satan stands among the sons of God and asks for permission to test the righteousness of Job. This shows that his role is closer to that of a public prosecutor who tests the sincerity of a human being, rather than an independent force outside God's control. In Zechariah 3, Satan appears to oppose Joshua the high priest, but the Lord himself intervenes to rebuke him. This scene clearly expresses the limitation of his authority and that his ultimate fate lies in God's hands, as he cannot go beyond the role assigned to him. With the transition from the Hebrew Bible to the period between the Testaments, the era preceding the emergence of Christianity, a major transformation occurred in the image of Satan. He was no longer merely a function of accusation under God's authority, but gradually began to take shape as a leader of cosmic evil. This development can be clearly observed in the Qumran texts and later Jewish literature. In the War Scroll 1QM, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we read about a decisive confrontation between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Here, Belial appears as the chief of the forces of darkness, leading the armies of evil against the faithful. This dualism, light/darkness, was not merely a literary metaphor, but formed new theological features in which evil came to be seen as an organized force with a leader and an army, rather than simply an individual human inclination. The Book of Jubilees presents another figure, Mastema, who is described as the chief of evil spirits. What distinguishes this text is that it does not deny God's supreme authority, but clarifies that Mastema is only allowed to tempt within the limits set by God. This concept paves the way for the idea that Satan acts as a cosmic enemy, yet remains bound by God's will, an idea that will later appear clearly in Christian theology. In the Book of Wisdom 2:24, we read, "Through the envy of the devil, death entered the world." This short statement had a tremendous impact because it linked, for the first time, the first sin in the book of Genesis with the devil. Here the foundation was laid upon which Christianity would later build its interpretation, that the serpent who tempted Eve was not merely an ordinary creature, but Satan himself in another form. When we pause at Isaiah 14:12-15, we find one of the most misunderstood passages in the Western religious tradition. The original Hebrew text speaks about the fall of the arrogant king of Babylon, using a poetic expression, Helel ben Shakar, meaning morning star or son of the dawn. This was a political metaphor mocking an earthly tyrant, not a report of a metaphysical event about an angel falling from heaven. However, when Jerome translated the text into the Latin Vulgate, this poetic title was transformed into a new word, Lucifer, meaning light-bearer. In Latin, the word was not originally a proper name for the devil, but a common astronomical description at the time for the planet Venus, when it appeared as the morning star. Yet in the following centuries, Christian interpretation began linking this passage with the image of the proud angel who sought to equal God, fell, and became Satan. This idea influenced Christian collective consciousness for centuries, as well as the way writers and artists imagined the figure of the devil. Understanding this gap between the original biblical meaning and the later interpretation is essential for grasping how the image of Satan was gradually constructed. It is a clear example of how a local poetic symbol could transform into a universal theological doctrine. This also explains why the name Lucifer became widespread in Christian literature and Western thought as a synonym for the devil, even though the original Hebrew context did not intend that meaning. With the development of Jewish religious thought in the period of Rabbinic Judaism, the concept of Satan acquired multiple dimensions that were not limited to what appeared in the early texts of the Hebrew Bible. In those texts, Satan was portrayed as the adversary or accuser, as seen in the book of Job. However, later rabbinic thought sought to merge different images of evil into a single figure. In the Babylonian Talmud, specifically in Bava Batra 16a, Satan is associated with three major forces: the evil inclination, known as the Yetzer Hara, the angel of death, and Satan himself as an external adversary. This association does not mean the existence of three independent entities. Rather, it reflects a unified system of trial that all operates under God's authority and judgment. Thus, Satan becomes an ethical language symbolizing the challenges that confront human beings in their journey. He is the inner desire that weakens the soul, the death that awaits all humans, and the spiritual adversary that pushes people toward sin. During the Middle Ages, a clear rationalist trend emerged in interpreting the meaning of Satan. This is particularly evident in the works of Moses Maimonides, one of the most prominent Jewish philosophers. Maimonides argued that Satan is not an independent being with its own authority, but rather a metaphor for illusion and psychological desire experienced by human beings. In this view, Satan becomes an intellectual metaphor referring to human weakness before personal desires and inner impulses, not a metaphysical force that competes with God or stands against Him. However, another current arose in opposition to this rationalist trend, represented by Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah. In this symbolic and mystical tradition, images of evil intensify in concepts such as Sitra Achra, meaning the other side, which represents the dark dimension of existence. They also appear in figures such as Samael, considered a leader of the forces of darkness, and Lilith, who became associated with popular legends as a symbol of temptation and nocturnal danger. Despite the symbolic power and intellectual attraction of these images, leading interpreters consistently warned against turning them into an explicit dualism that would make evil an independent force confronting good, because such a view would undermine the Jewish principle of monotheism, which affirms the absolute unity of God and rejects any notion of another deity representing evil. In the modern era, Jewish movements have differed in how they approach the concept of Satan. Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism adopted a purely symbolic interpretation, viewing Satan not as an independent being, but as an expression of the psychological and moral struggle within the human person. Meanwhile, Orthodox Judaism maintained the presence of Satan in religious texts and teachings, yet approached the concept in a dual manner that combines symbolism and textual tradition. In this perspective, Satan continues to be mentioned and studied as a way of emphasizing moral responsibility and controlling human desires. The final conclusion that emerged within rabbinic jurisprudence affirms that Satan, in rabbinic Judaism, has never been an equal rival to God, nor a god of evil. Rather, it is a moral and spiritual language of testing, reminding human beings that sin begins within them through desire. Yet it often takes on an external symbolic form in the image of an adversary or the other side. In historical Christian theology, the image of Satan became firmly established as that of an angel who was originally created good and pure, but who, through his free will, chose rebellion and pride, fell, and became the devil, humanity's enemy and God's adversary. In the doctrine of the Catholic Church, the catechetical teaching emphasizes that the devil was not created evil, but became corrupted through his own free choice. His power is therefore not absolute, but limited, since God alone is the supreme sovereign. Although Satan tempts human beings, humans are not forced into sin. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, victory over Satan was achieved, and the Church lives out the fruits of this victory through the sacraments and the gospel mission. In Eastern Orthodoxy, the devil is likewise understood as a fallen spiritual being who seeks to corrupt creation and distance human beings from the image of God within them. Nevertheless, the life of the Church, including prayer, fasting, and the Eucharist, represents a daily confrontation with his influence and an affirmation that the resurrection has already nullified his ultimate domination. As for Protestantism, it reflects a wide spectrum of positions. Some interpret Satan literally as a real personal enemy, while others adopt a symbolic or socio-theological reading, viewing Satan as a language that describes organized evil and structural injustice within societies. Yet what remains common among all Christian traditions is that the devil is not an equal rival to God in a balanced struggle of power. Rather, God's sovereignty is absolute, while Satan's authority is secondary, parasitic, and ultimately limited. The development of the image of Satan was not isolated from the transformations of history and society. Rather, it was deeply connected to the religious and social contexts in which these perceptions emerged. With the rise of early Christian communities and their effort to establish a distinct identity, the language of demonizing the other was used to describe opponents, whether they were opposing Jewish groups or rival Christian movements. This language served both a theological and a social function, as it helped define collective identity and strengthen internal cohesion by determining who belonged to the community and who was excluded from it. In this context, Satan was no longer merely a distant supernatural being, but also a linguistic tool used to name and embody evil in the different or opposing other. With the development of modern ethical and philosophical interpretations, the image of Satan acquired broader dimensions. It began to be read on two interconnected levels. On the one hand, as an external force representing the evil that pursues and tempts human beings from the outside, and on the other hand, as an internal force dwelling within the human soul, embodying desire, the will to dominate, and pride. Thus, in the biblical narrative, Satan operates on two complementary fronts: temptation that comes from outside, and an inner readiness for wrongdoing that resides within the human being himself. At the same time, the authority possessed by the devil is understood to be limited and temporary, and his end is already determined within the framework of the divine conclusion. In the end, the story of Satan remains a mirror reflecting humanity's anxieties and questions about good and evil, freedom and destiny. The struggle, at its core, is not only external but also within the human being, between weakness and will, fear and hope. And here we reach the end of today's video. Don't miss the opportunity to follow all that is new by subscribing to the channel and activating the notification bell so you receive every new update.